Boa tarde ao público que nos assiste. Chegamos até aqui depois de uma semana intensa de trabalho e de reflexão conjunta, e agora é hora de concluir. E nada melhor de fazer isso com o nosso convidado de hoje para a sessão plenária final, professor Sinfrey Makoni, que vai dividir a sua reflexão sobre decolonialidade com uma fala intitulada Uma mirada nos multilinguismos do Sul. O professor é nosso conhecido, né? Na verdade dispensaria introduções, mas mesmo assim eu gostaria de ressaltar uma série de coisas importantes na sua trajetória acadêmica. O professor Makoni é um dos mais renovados linguistas aplicados da atualidade, atuando no cenário global. Lecionou em diferentes universidades, como a Universidade do Cabo Ocidental e a Universidade do Cabo. Atualmente é professor extraordinário na Universidade do Noroeste da África do Sul e do Departamento de Linguística Aplicada e no programa de Estudos Africanos da Universidade Estadual da Pensilvânia, dos Estados Unidos. Suas principais áreas de pesquisa são política e planejamento linguístico, com foco em epistemologias e ontologias do Sul. Sua reflexão está presente em obras como Disinventing and Reconstituting Languages, de 2007, uma referência entre nós, e Innovations and Challenges in Applied Linguistics from the Global South, uma publicação de 2019, produzidos em coautoria com Palestra Pennycook. Em 2022, este ano, portanto, publicou
You went on mute, Branca, professora. You went on mute, professora. Professora Branco? You're on mute. I don't think she sees us. Professora? Professora? Do you hear us? You're on mute, actually. You're on mute. We cannot hear you.
Sorry. So I have to start again.
Now we can hear you, but no, you're just saying that he published this year, 2022, an article, and then you went on mute.
Okay, I'll repeat that. Então, em 2022, ele publicou pela Routledge o Routledge Handbook of Language and the Global South, uma publicação que inclui capítulos de colegas nossas, Glenda Mello, Cristina Severo e Joana Pinto. E esses trabalhos vêm exercendo um grande impacto na nossa forma de pensar a linguagem, políticas linguísticas e direitos linguísticos. E disse também que o projeto que mais empolga o professor Makoni atualmente é o projeto chamado Global South, que acontece todas as sextas-feiras, online, e recebe é aberto a pesquisadores e pesquisadoras de todo o mundo. So, Professor Makoni, it's a pleasure to have you here with us for this closing plenary session. The floor is yours. We're really looking forward to hearing you.
It's a great pleasure to be able to have a chance of presenting our work to you. The work that I'm going to be presenting this afternoon is part of our ongoing work with my colleague, Christine Severo. We are going to try and focus on what we are calling Southern approaches toward language, going beyond anthropocentric orientation to language and communication research. Southern approaches toward language are meant to develop what we are calling an approach towards Southern multilingualism. To argue that if either decolonization, whatever that might mean, or Southern epistemologies are to be successful, develop alternative approaches toward language and interactional practices. Argue that even if we conceived that linguistics or applied linguistics may illuminate language, they should not be allowed to be the sole determining means of so. Otherwise, a form of disciplinary decadence, as Lewis Gordon puts it, would set in. But what is disciplinary decadence? Disciplinary decadence, as we have seen according to Lewis Gordon, process of critical decay with a field or discipline. Such instances, the proponent ontologizes his or her discipline far beyond its scope. For example, a decadent scientist criticizes the humanities for not being scientific. A decadent literary scholar criticizes scientists and social scientists for not being literary or textual. Paying attention to an interdisciplinary framework, we seek to expand the analytical approaches that can be adopted towards the analysis of language. Seek to expand the analytical approaches that can be adopted towards what we may call ontologies of language. So, we explore the implications of analyzing language and framed through water and oceans as analytical categories. Also explore the debate on the limits of anthropocentrism and how this may contribute towards an expansion of our concept of language. When, for example, we briefly characterize the nature of one, animal sound, two, tree talk, three, tree communication, four, trans-species communication, five, city talk, or other genres of analysis in the expansion of approaches to language which we are seeking to decolonize. Now, let's move on to what we call wet ontologies as ways of framing language. Does water shape our conceptual images of language in the global south? is relevant to frame language using water because the planet is largely water, and every one of us is approximately 80% water. Thus, water is not out there, it is in us. Furthermore, it is important to consider water because what we think water is has an impact on how we shape and treat it, as well as on how we frame language. Waterscape epistemology, or as we call it now, wet epistemology, materiality, dramatic shift from the perception of language as single-rooted monolingual speaker to that of a multilingual migrant. Wet epistemology encapsulates the paradoxical relationship between one, liquidity, and two, solidity. We seek to explore the implications of such epistemology to the notion of language as the following. And we quote Goulden here, open quote, water needs riverbanks or coastlines to be perceived. These are not limitations, but necessary for an orientation in the endless vastness of the ocean. The same holds true for languages and their interaction. Fluidity has to be complemented by solidity and vice versa. Water always contains soil in some form, and land is always permeated by water. Following Steinberg and Peters, we will not only treat the sea as a background against which we treat language, but also investigate the impact of what Isabel Hofmeyr calls the seaness of the sea on our framing of language. The ocean provides a fertile environment for reconceptualizing our understanding of one, space, two, time, three, movement, and the expression of being in a transformative and mobile world. Liquid materiality, we argue, allows for new ways of thinking, not only about water, but also with and through the land. We argue that critical perspectives can be gained by taking the ocean's liquidity seriously. Nevertheless, we are also self-critical. We question the basis of wet ontology, particularly the distinction between land and ocean. For the ocean is not simply liquid, it is also solid and air. It generates winds which transport smells, and these may travel miles inland. Although earlier attention to the ocean's liquidity was a necessary antidote to superficial ontology, we take the discussion further by exploring what emerges if instead we were to approach the ocean as offering more than wet ontology, wherein in its fluid is continuously produced and dissipated, as Steinberg and Peters put it. Giving attention to wet ontology and going beyond it affect how we frame language. Because, and we quote here Steinberg and Peters, there are diverse approaches to writing about or of the sea. And the way we engage with the sea, and our relationship with the sea should also be diverse. In other words, the word ontology in writing in the Global South has an impact on our daily engagement with seanesses and oceanes. We also compare different approaches to word ontologies, including 1, indigenous perspectives to word ontologies, 2, urban approaches to word ontologies, 3, the relationship in the way word ontologies are conceptualized in situations of conflict. And now let me quote Arturo Escobar here. The notion of a one world, or what he calls is a zero WW, signals the predominant idea in the West that we all live within a single world made up of one underlying reality, one nature, and many cultures. This imperialistic notion supposes the West's ability to arrogate for itself the right to be the world and to subject all other worlds to its rules, to diminish them to secondary status, to non-existence, often figuratively and materially. It is a very seductive notion. The objective of our presentation is to argue that another world of language is indeed possible, that it is feasible to move beyond the zero WW. Movement beyond the zero WW is possible if we create a path and walk it together with human and what Escobar calls other human earth beings, including trees and other species. Movement beyond the zero WW demands that we consider social and linguistic phenomenon from other epistemological and ontological perspectives, and build knowledges from below, from the grassroots, and in some cases, from below trees in forests. The development of epistemologies, ontology, and knowledges from below requires relinking, which is different from Minolo's de-linking. Relinking is a radically different move, as it involves the cultivation of worlds rooted in an engagement with other human earth beings. Relinking also implies setting in and acting in and with all the other earth beings. This means that trees, stones, our ancestors, the elements can be characterized as social, as Suraj Krabbe puts it. If trees are all part of the social, sociolinguists will involve investigating how trees interact with each other, what may be referred to as tree talk, or how humans interact and communicate with other species that are not human, but are our other fellow earth beings. Investigations into tree talk and interactions between humans and other species, and including, for example, dogs, or interacting amongst different species who find themselves sharing the same space with us, will constitute an indispensable part of a project of studying language in the Global South, a project that seeks to go beyond an anthropocentric orientation to language and communication. Going beyond anthropocentrism in language studies. One example of how the debate on the limits of anthropocentrism may contribute to expand our concept of language has to do with a critical sub-area of music studies named ethnomusicology, which problematizes universal aspects of music, such as the idea of absolute and pure music. The essence that so powerfully discriminates between what is and is not music, we may ask. The concept of music is political, since it favors and legitimizes certain sounds in detriment to others. The underlying discussion on the concept of music includes questioning the limits between nature and culture in the definition of what constitutes music. The idea of zoomusicology, for example, recognizes that animals carry an aesthetic function. This means that animals' songs cannot be reduced to a repetitive, intrinsic, and mechanical practice. Rather, the acoustic environment may influence the way certain animals produce signals, such as grasshoppers. Also, there are several disordered sounds produced by insects, fish, mammals, and birds that do not fit the traditional taxonomy. Anthropocentrism has contributed to creating an ideology of human sound, which is analogous to human language, as being different from animal noise, in which the former rational and ordering dimension worked as a criteria to define the meanings and limits of music is overlooked. Actually, the balance between order and disorder that characterized most animals' acoustic signal is one core example of musical traits. Another example is the notion of entomusic, concerning how music can be made with effects, such as the project carried out by the Brazilian musician Pedro Filho Amoriano, who produced a concept for the insects following two steps. First, recording and codifying the insect sounds in specific soundscape by detecting a wide range of ultrasounds. And second, converting human music phonograms sounds appreciable by insects. Such concepts for the insects also problematizes human notions of listening by extending its limits to integrate several sounds that generally cannot be processed by human ears. Technology allied to animal sounds and human sensibilities may contribute to expand our capacity to and interact with the world beyond the limits of our senses, even though we may continuously interrogate to what extent can one ever comprehend the sensory world of the other. Concerning the role played by technology in contemporary and future times, it is worth mentioning, as Lovelock's thesis puts it, on the emergence of the age of hyper-intelligence, the Novacene, which would surpass the age of the Anthropocene. For Lovelock, for example, the Novacene has already started and can be defined by how technology moves beyond our control, generating intelligences far greater and much faster than our own. It differs from Technocene because at this present time, the Novacene and human technology are impelled to work together in favor of life. The ethical dimension concerning the use of technology will be under continuous debate, mainly because the world of the future will be determined by the need to ensure Gaia's survival, not by the selfish needs of humans or other intelligent species. Gaia is understood by Lovelock as a single organism, which means that nature and human beings are not independent, separate, and autonomous entities, but are internally connected, communicating at several levels with each other. Such interconnectedness also characterizes the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which, and we quote, speaks to the idea of non-isolationism of man from everything and everyone around him, including nature. What this portends is that a man is never complete or whole in himself or herself. We argue that the ethical dimension becomes a core criteria to define what constitutes as communication in decolonization and Southern epistemologies. The concept of communication cannot be limited to a linear production of speech, nor be dependent on an abstract concept of language as verbal sign. Decolonial and Southern concepts of language are concerned with notions of communication that transcend an anthropocentric perspective that reduces language to abstract, rational, individualistic, and cognitive reality. This means we should be able to problematize the concept of language underpinning modern notions of rationality. And now we will quote Lovelock, page 2090, to illustrate this. The form of speeches lay behind the mistake we made in continuing to reason classically and put the exceptions that science revealed, like quantum physics, into different worlds that appeared to coexist with us. We made the mistake because of the nature of speech, either spoken or written, combined with the tendency of human thought to break things down into component parts. The concept of communication requires an expanded understanding of the role played by the senses in communication and production of meaning. This discussion may include other problematizations, such as the predominance of sight in modern knowledge production, including the objectifying colonial gaze, in detriment to notions of touch or scent. Following the anthropology of senses, the senses play a different role in different cultural settings and may also be used as a strategy of control and domination. In colonial times, the senses were racialized through the Western association of lower races with the lower senses. The lower senses would include taste, smell, touch, and were associated with the body instead of the mind. African peoples, for example, are described as being ruled by their stomachs. Native Americans are stated to have extraordinary powers of smell. We believe the discussions of the limits of the anthropocentricism is in line with a materialist post-humanistic perspective of language, insofar as language is considered from a non-idealistic, isolated, and abstract perspective. We agree that sociolinguistic repertoires need to be understood in terms of spatial distribution, social practices, material embodiment, rather than the individual competence of the sociolinguistic actor who has held center stage over the past few decades, as Alistair Pennycook puts it. Now we move on to the other part of our presentations. Can trees communicate? Can we have what we can call the wood wide web? In addition to the concept of communication underlying the notion of Gaia as a single living organism, we mentioned discussion concerning how forests integrate a social network and communicate through scent, sound, visual, and electrical signs. Also, most trees communicate through the fungi that inhabit their roots. They also warn each other using chemical signals sent through the fungal networks through their root tips. Trees talk to each other through underground networks of helper fungi called mycorrhizal fungi that mingle with each other. Furthermore, trees can connect to different species the microchaetae create species for communicating between trees, what Sinard refers felicitously to as the equivalent of nature's internet, the World Wide Web. When the mother, the oldest tree, is dying, it dumps resources so that they can be provided to younger trees. Trees, according to Sinard, should be construed as a superorganism that can chat and exchange information with the same species, and at times even across different species through fungi. The microchaetae allow not only for tree-fungi symbiosis, but also for communication between trees. Sinard draws parallels between tree communication and neural networks to the human brain. Trees can use chemicals to communicate, to warn their neighbors that an attack is imminent, so that they should protect themselves. From such a perspective, trees should not be seen as solitary actors, but as chatty, big superorganisms. Now I move on to trans-species pigeons. Eduardo Kohn, for example, investigates the nature of communication between humans and dogs, which he refers to as trans-species communication. In trans-species communication is a type of pigeon analogous to motherese, which is a distinctive type of language that caregivers use when interacting with children. A trans-species pigeon, although it facilitates communication across species for Kohn between dogs and humans, puts the brakes on processes which render it difficult to establish firm boundaries between different kinds of beings. By using a trans-species pigeon that is characterized by reduced grammatical structure, boundaries between humans, and in Eduardo Kohn's case with dogs, are retained even though reduced and are not collapsed. By using trans-species pigeons to put the brakes on blurring boundaries between humans and dogs, Kohn implicitly concurs with the scholar's position. From distinctions between humans and non-humans, nature and culture may be ethnocentric because there is no universally agreed criteria of what constitutes humans, where being human ends and being non-human starts, and what constitutes personhood. If we are to frame either a linguistics or an approach that goes beyond human, it is necessary to understand what it means to be human theoretically and ideologically. Tim Ingold framed what it means to be human and what it means to be alive through his notion of lines. He argues that a universe of life is woven from knots and not, as is frequently thought to be the case, from blocks. Knotting, he argues, because it metaphorically captures how things join one another. To study life and to study what it means to be human, we must study the weather, he argues. The critical question that needs to be investigated is whether the nature and form that trans-species pigeons assume are comparable across different contexts. Eduardo Kohn, for example, studied what was carried out in South America. It is therefore relevant to ask whether the form and grammatical structure of trans-species pigeons will assume comparable or identical characteristics in form and function in Africa or South America. In other words, do trans-species pigeons share common universal characteristics? In other words, is universalism something that we should aim for or something that we should seek to undercut? Can a city talk? Sasson argues that speech is not uniquely human. Cities, according to Sasson, have speech, albeit of a different nature from that of humans and corporations, and perhaps dissimilar from the tree talk of the world wide, of the wood wide web. This means that we have not yet exhausted all the different speech types and language typologies. To comprehend how the city can have speech, Sasson expands the analytical terrain of the notion of the city and what constitutes speech. He defines cities as follows, and we quote, "Cities are complex systems, but they are incomplete systems. In this incompleteness lies the possibility of making the urban, the political, and civic. The city is not alone in having these characteristics, but these characteristics are part of the DNA of the urban." Close quote. Page 220, page 209, 2013. When we are studying how cities talk, this line of research is different from research that investigates and characterizes different language varieties used by the youth in urban settings. Such studies focus on how urban youth use different urban language varieties to mark their identity, social status, gender, and so forth. In such studies, it is the youth, human beings, and not the cities themselves that talk, which is the argument that we are trying to make in this presentation. The traffic jam is an example of a city talking. A car built for speed it exits the highway and enters the city. It hits a traffic jam, composed not just of cars, but of people bustling around. Suddenly, this car is crippled. Built for speed, as mobility is arrested, the city has spoken. The city, particularly the street, is a space where the powerless have the capacity to create and make history, difficult to do in rural areas. In cities, crowds can be visible and political, enabling them to make history. And now let me quote Sasson again. The city speech is a capability to alter the shape, to invite, all following a logic that aims at enhancing or protecting the city's complexity. And let me continue with the quotation from Sasson. The city is another example of city talk. One example is the early high-end gentrification in Manhattan, in New York City. A whole new visual order that could not for a while render invisible the homeless it had produced. A second example is the immigrant street vendor on Wall Street, catering to the high-speed, high-level financier in a rush, altering the visual corporate landscape with the robust smell of roasted sausages. We are, however, aware of the danger that by emphasizing that cities talk, if taken too far, we may be criticized for anthropomorphizing the city. This anthropomorphizing the city is what we are trying to move away from as we seek to develop a linguistics and applied linguistics that is not exclusively human-centered, even as a means to be human is complicated theoretically and socially. Drawing on intergenerational semiology, what constitutes language in tree talk, city talk, or the use of proverbs cannot be determined in advance of the communication and is not independent of tree talk or trans-species. Communication in both tree talk and trans-species pigeons is a creative process that involves a large number of unknown factors that form the basis of the communicational context of interaction between humans, animals, and other species, or between trees. Within this approach, signs are not given in advance, but are created in the here and now. For example, the communicability of the sign by a tree is for the purposes of forewarning other trees of imminent danger or for sharing resources by a dying mother tree, which depends upon a constellation of existing factors. And drawing from intergenerational linguistics, biomechanical, macrosocial, and circumstantial. An expanded approach to communication among animals involves analyzing how different animals communicate with diverse species with whom they must share their universe. What is the way forward? In the way forward, we seek to challenge ethnocentric approaches that treat distinctions between humans in one culture as true or in all other cultures, either explicitly or implicitly. The introduction that we've been trying to mark follows the Amazonian tendency to treat certain elements in the environment as persons endowed with cognitive, moral, and social qualities analogous to those of the human, and thus to be incorporated within the category of persons, spirits, plants, and animals, as Viviero de Castro puts it. If we seek to fight against the disciplinary decadence that we talked about at the beginning, faced by fields of linguistic and applied linguistics, the construct of pluriversal futures requires that we epistemologically decolonize language studies to enable us to analyze the nature of communication, not only between humans, but between other species. For example, communication in the wide web among trees. Such a pluriversal linguistic system, which we are seeking to bring about, is in sharp contrast to the monocultural, universal, extractivist world of global language scholarship. This epistemological marginalization is a consequence of imperialism or colonialism, or what Suraj Krab calls the Death Project. We therefore are not able to dictate how linguistics or applied linguistics can or should be decolonized. Decolonization cannot adopt an intellectual recipe approach because decolonization, as Minolo would put it, is an option. The decolonization of linguistics and sociolinguistics that we propose is grounded in a strong belief that decolonization movements are neither fashions nor buzzwords, which are likely to dissipate in the near future. The critique of linguistics that we make is not limited to dominant liberal narratives about language and social life, but rather can be extended to Marxist and other critical approaches to language, because the models that colonialists use involve a set of analytical frameworks drawn from Gramsci, Foucault, Derrida, etc. In most cases, the frameworks are Western, but the raw materials for analysis may be Indian, Latin America, or African. The reverse rarely occurs, for example. African, Indian, or Latin American intellectual thought are rarely used to frame Western social experiences. Finally, decolonial theory, even though indispensable in challenging Eurocentrism in applied linguistics, has not yet produced a coherent framework, but there are recurring features that are central to the theory. This is one, it constitutes a critique of Western knowledge. Two, distribution and transformation of knowledge. And three, it criticizes the racism that is part of the legacy of colonialism. Finally, the momentum of decolonization in Southern epistemologies is driven by three factors. One, the fall of the West and the rise of the rest. Two, the collapse of the socialist bloc and the demise of Marxism. And three, the crisis of Western civilization. Thank you. Oh, God.
Wow.
Can I run away now?
What a thought-provoking talk and very stimulating. I'll read, there are many comments on the chat, stuff like, what an original approach, extremely interesting. I've never heard about such ideas. Food for thought, intriguing. and so on and so forth. So thank you very much. And I know that you don't have much time, but I have selected 2 questions.
Yes,
So
yes.
the first one is, can you explain a little further how transspecies communication and wet epistemology can decolonize or problematize monolingualism? What can we learn from different creatures? This is the first question. And the second one, asked by Glenda Mello, whom you know. She asks, if we don't succeed in interspecies communication, how can transspecies communication make a difference?
Okay, yeah. Let me start off with the argument about word epistemologies, and then I can move on to the question. The argument that we're trying to make here is that we need to seriously begin to think of other ways of imagining the world. Most of the approaches about applied linguistics that we have been using tend to draw upon notions, they are grounded on the ideas of land. But water is everywhere. Oceans, seas, there's life under the oceans, for example. So we are saying we should allow our imaginations to develop further by trying to understand things about language applied linguistics that are influenced by the ocean. Let me give you a good example. If this conversation was taking place under the ocean, how would we imagine the conversation that we're talking about? How would we talk about things about monolingualism make sense if, for example, this conversation, if this was a classroom under the ocean? If you just think about it, like if this was a classroom under the ocean, with fish all over around us, sharks all over around that particular universe all over around, is the entire apparatus that we have got in applied linguistics, would that still be relevant? Or we would need to rethink what we are doing? Or putting it more differently, as I put it in another context, if we were in a ship as sailors moving from New York City on our way to Brazil, and we were discussing issues about applied linguistics, how will that world look like? What has tended to happen in applied linguistics and linguistics is that it has tended to be framed from the perspectives of language teachers, language learners, but not other communities experience language. What was the second question that...
Yeah, so what you're saying is that we need new metaphors and
yes,
like what if questions. What if?
What if? Yes, that is the point. Yeah. The issue is not so much whether we're going to be correct or not. What we need is new metaphors, and then say to ourselves, what if this was the case? What are the consequences of taking this particular decision? What has tended to happen in applied linguistics has been like this. We say, oh, what you are saying is not true of my context in Zimbabwe or in Cape Town, etc. But instead of saying, what if your thinking was different? How would you? What are the consequences of viewing our practices if we fundamentally shift what we understand? So, for example, if you work on an assumption that we have not yet exhausted the descriptions about language, then what it means is we still need more basic descriptions about language. But what tends to happen is we get the impression that we have exhausted the discussions about language. We know that there's morphology, phonology, syntax, this, and this is all that there is. And then we go out to look for evidence to fit into the categories. But I am saying completely the opposite. I'm saying that the basic infrastructure of thinking about language is still inadequate, right? That is what we need to do. We should not preempt come to the conclusion that we've already exhausted how we think language can be imagined. The other human species may understand languages completely differently. Completely differently. Not only are there differences between how different human beings understand languages, if you include other species, other what we call here, other earth beings, they may experience language completely different. And that is what we need to do. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other question is, if we don't succeed in interspecies communication, how can transspecies communication make a difference? This was the question asked by Glenda Mello.
Yes. What I mean is the issue of one should not get too worried about whether we succeed or not succeed. What is most important is the fact that the interspecies communication has been taking place over a long historical process. There's no community in the world that does not have one form or other of interspecies communication. What has happened, however, is that interspecies communication has not been regarded as central to how linguistics imagines itself. But there is no community anywhere in the world that you can tell me in which you find human beings talking to human beings. Human beings talk to other species, whether they're trees, water, dogs, they always interact with other species. But linguistics, and to some extent applied linguistics, is very reductionist. It is then defined and said, no, the only interaction that we will try and regard as purely human language is between. And that runs counter to the experiences of most people. Even any kid, when they're growing up, they interact with other species and not only their parents, right? But when they get into a class in linguistics, they then are told that, no. The only that you need to analyze is between human beings and human beings. The interaction between human beings and your other species, your pets, etc., that falls outside the rubric of what constitutes legitimate inquiry in sociolinguistics. That is the point which is there. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll have to let you go, but I'd just like to mention a comment by one of our colleagues, Lilian Abram dos Santos. She mentions a very recent publication entitled Vegetable Voices.
Oh, I'd like to read that one. Yeah, send me.
I will.
I would like. Yes.
I will. Diversity, resistance, and stories of the forest. You know.
Okay.
I'll send you.
Send me this. Yeah. Thank you very much. This has been.
Thank you very much. I know we have to let you go.
It's been very helpful.
Yeah.
I appreciate the invitations. If you want me to talk for a longer time in future, just make sure, just get Christine to get hold of me. She knows how to what.
I know.
She knows, she manages me from a distance. So.
All right. Thank you, Christine, for having helped us. Okay.
Oh yeah, don't tell you. Just talk to Christine. Christine knows how to. I must say, I mean, publicly, she's a wonderful scholar. I've learned more from her than she has ever learned from me.
Okay, we are glad to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll let you go
now. Bye-bye. Okay.
Bye-bye. Por favor, fiquem nesta sala para o encerramento. A Claudiana vai falar com a gente. Aguardem um segundo.
Boa noite a todas e a todos. É com muita alegria que nós encerramos esse 13º Congresso Brasileiro de Linguística Aplicada, com muito amor no coração e gratidão a todas que participaram deste evento. Estivemos em todos esses dias juntas, juntos e juntes, para agradecer por toda a participação. Nós tivemos 1.300 inscritos no nosso evento, né? Participaram professoras, professores, cotistas, estudantes cotistas, pesquisadoras e pesquisadores, distribuídos em 18 simpósios temáticos, 15 simpósios convidados, 8 seminários de teses. O número de trabalhos por simpósio temático foram 937 trabalhos, distribuídos em 33 eixos. Nós tivemos também 85 trabalhos na jornada de iniciação científica, comunicação oral, 162 trabalhos e 15 mesas redondas. Estivemos em pessoas, convidados, pesquisadoras de todas as regiões do Brasil. Nós tivemos 493 inscrições do Sudeste, 337 do Nordeste, 216 do Sul, 107 do Centro-Oeste, 52 do Norte, 49 pessoas não informaram a localização e tivemos 46 pessoas inscritas do exterior. Ao todo, 1.300 pessoas unidas, sentindo o calor de Fortaleza, nesse ambiente tão especial que nós preparamos para vocês, trazendo o nosso senso crítico, a nossa força, a nossa resistência e, sobretudo, a arte do esperançar, do acreditar em novos dias. Nós queremos agradecer à comissão organizadora, na pessoa dessas 5 mulheres maravilhosas aqui, 4 porque são minhas companheiras, da diretoria, Branca Fabrício, Nucássia Araújo, Dilamar Araújo, Glenda Valim de Mello, e também agradecer à comissão organizadora local, que foi maravilhosa, que esteve conosco por muitos meses antes do evento, e em especial deixar o nosso abraço, o nosso agradecimento à comissão de monitoria, a todas as monitoras e monitores que estiveram conosco esses dias, ferrenhamente aqui, perseverando, né, no horário, abrindo as salas, porque foi para nós um grande desafio fazer esse evento híbrido. Nós tivemos aqui presencialmente o evento, mas também estávamos juntos com vocês nas salas, nos computadores, e essa equipe de monitoria esteve aqui conosco presencialmente, sustentando as salas, não é, dia, noite. Vocês viram que o nosso evento ocorreu manhã, tarde e noite. Então, estivemos por muito tempo juntinhos, e essas pessoas maravilhosas, né, na pessoa da Ludovica, do Márcio, que coordenaram a comissão, da Catiane, estiveram aqui conosco por todos os dias. Também queremos celebrar com vocês a nova gestão da LAB, né? Nós tivemos a assembleia e tivemos uma nova diretoria eleita. Foi muita alegria para nós podermos ver essas mulheres maravilhosas e esses meninos maravilhosos também. Vai ser uma diretoria, não é, dividida. Nós temos a professora Doris, não é? A professora Cristiane, o professor Wagner, o professor Danilo, a professora Kelly, o professor Alexandre Cadilli, a nova diretoria da LAB, e a gente agradece muito por vocês terem colocado os nomes à disposição, também o conselho, né, o professor Junô e o professor Daniel Silva, e que também deram seus nomes também à disposição para o Conselho Fiscal e Consultivo da LAB. Agradecemos a todas e a todos, as comissões, os GTs, que nos apoiaram na nossa gestão, não é? E nós vamos também colocar depois à disposição de vocês o resultado da nossa jornada de iniciação científica e da nossa mostra de cinema, não é? Nós vamos enviar para todos os sócios, associadas e associados, qual foi o resultado, não é? Todo mundo aí querendo saber, e logo que o sistema fechar e que nós descobrirmos, né, quem foram os vitoriosos, nós vamos enviar para vocês e teremos a premiação também para essas pessoas. Então, com muita alegria, com muita esperança, não é, no coração, como diz o nosso querido Belchior, que nos deixou, não é? Amar e mudar as coisas nos interessa mais. E nesses dias, todos nós provamos, todos, que amar e mudar as coisas nos interessa mais. Muito obrigada por todas que estiveram presentes, todos, todes, e com um grande abraço, com muita gratidão no coração, eu encerro esse 13º Congresso Brasileiro de Linguística Aplicada.